Welcome. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Donna Fernandez from Wallis Annenberg PetSpace. In 2017, we established the Wallis Annenberg PetSpace Leadership Institute to promote multidisciplinary scholarship focused on the human-animal bond, and we welcomed our very first class of Leadership Institute Fellows. Their inaugural collaboration resulted in a white paper published in the journal Animals entitled Humanity's Best Friend, a dog-centric approach to addressing global challenges. In 2020, we convened our second class of Leadership Institute Fellows to focus on the medical, psychological, and societal benefits of dogs in modern society, particularly as companion animals and working dogs. This brief video gives you more information about the Leadership Institute and provides highlights from our two-day summit in February of 2020.
Wallis Annenberg PetSpace is a unique community center devoted to studying, celebrating, and strengthening the human-animal bond. It's an interactive space for pet adoptions, an education center, and home to the Wallis Annenberg PetSpace Leadership Institute. The Leadership Institute was established in 2017 to convene the leading academics in the field to exchange ideas and collaborate.
When I received the invitation, I thought 2 whole days getting to really think and talk about ideas is a real rarity and just right up my street. That's my idea of a good day out.
Together, they are furthering our understanding of the mutual benefits of the human-animal bond. The latest cohort of fellows convened in March 2020 for a 2-day summit focusing on the modern-day implications dogs have in society.
This has been a really incredible opportunity to meet with experts in the field and really expand our understanding of how the human-animal bond intersects with working dogs and service dogs, and really think about ideas of how we can move it all forward together as opposed to all in our individual worlds.
The way that the format has been quite nice, that we have very brief talks where we get to give a simple overview of what's going on in our labs and what we're doing, but then lots of time to just sit and talk with each other in different groups. It's created a very strong cohort so that it'll be easy for us to pick up the phone or send an email to someone who otherwise we wouldn't have ever known in another area and just say, hey, let's do this research together.
We're here with some of the best people in the world. I mean, to me, this is like a dream come true.
It's like finding your people, yeah, absolutely.
I think I'm going to think a little bit differently about everything I do because everybody else's ideas are now sort of infused into the things that I think about on a day-to-day basis.
I'm blown away by the generosity and just really inspired by this initiative to invite people together to focus on the human-animal bond. I think that is really unique and special, and I'm really impressed by the facility and just also the opportunities that this will afford.
Leadership Institute convenings have resulted in collaborative papers published in peer-reviewed journals, including Animals and a special series in Frontiers in Veterinary Science. This collection of 14 papers aims to contribute to the current understanding of human-animal interaction, suggests future directions in research, and discusses the societal implications of the findings.
This is something that is needed, and I am just grateful that there's someone that really understands what is needed right now to make pet adoption successful. Kudos. I am just so impressed with this place.
By gathering together some of the biggest names in human-animal interaction research and creating opportunities for them to collaborate, Annenberg PetSpace is helping the world further understand the human-animal bond and creating a community where people and pets connect.
We were so lucky to have such an incredibly respected, diverse, and energized group of academics come together. Their enthusiasm resulted in collaboration among both groups of fellows on a special research topic for the journal's Frontiers in Veterinary Science, entitled Our Canine Connection, the History, Benefits, and Future of Human-Dog Interactions. Today, we're excited to welcome 4 of our Leadership Institute fellows for a special panel discussion covering everything from how dogs came to be part of our world to the potential benefits of this bond, how we can improve how we study this interaction, and what implications all of this has for the future. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our panel moderator, Dr. Patrick Flynn. Dr. Flynn received his veterinary degree from Virginia Maryland College of Veterinary Medicine in 1994 and practiced companion animal medicine and surgery for 13 years before joining then Pfizer, now Zoetis. His passion and curiosity for the scientific study of the role of other animals play in our life led him to Canisius College in Buffalo, New York, where I used to teach, by the way, where in 2019, he completed a Master's of Science in Anthrozoology. He also serves as the president-elect of the Human-Animal Bond Association. Welcome, Dr. Flynn.
Thank you so much, Donna. And yay, Canisius, right? Wonderful. I'm so proud and honored really to be part of this and to be able to help moderate this tonight. I'd love to say good morning or good evening or whatever, but the reality is we have people from not only our panelists, but people listening from all over the world. I know for sure people in UK and in New Zealand and in the United States as well. So it speaks to the impact and the importance of what we're talking about. And also kind of a fun, safe zone for those of us who are dog people to just be okay with dogs. Usually the cat people come parachuting in and they tell you, no, not cats, and cats are super important, and everybody else, all the other creatures, certainly important. But I think it's fun to have a little bit of time to just talk about dogs with some of the truly world's experts on dogs. So the way this is gonna work, we'll go through some individual questions, we'll go through some panel questions, and we'll do that through the bulk of the hour. At the end, we'll have, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 minutes or so, hopefully for some questions from the audience. I can't promise everyone's question will be answered live, but we'll make an effort to do that. But I think the discussion should be really good and should be fun. So with that, I'm going to actually ask each one of our panelists to do 2 things. One is to kind of introduce themselves, just so we all know for sure who you guys are and what you're doing and where you come from. And then dogs, why dogs? Why, who cares? Well, why have you devoted so much time and effort into dogs? So let me start with Dr. Serpell, and he can give us his info.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel. I hope everybody can hear me, although I'm getting a message to unmute myself.
I can hear you.
Anyway, my current position is Professor Emeritus of Animal Welfare at the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine. I'm not a veterinarian by training. My background is mainly in animal behavior. And I've been interested in this relationships between people and dogs really since I was an undergraduate student in London, and I attended a course at the Institute of Archaeology in London, and there I learned that the dog was the first animal to be domesticated, or I should say the wolf was the first animal to be domesticated. And it just struck me at the time how very strange, of all the creatures to domesticate first, why on earth would our Paleolithic ancestors choose to domesticate the wolf? So that's how I got in on this.
Excellent. All right, and we'll talk more about that here in just a little bit. Dr. Mclean, you're up next.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you. My name is Evan Mclean. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Arizona and director of the Arizona Canine Cognition Center, which is a research group where we study how dogs think and also study the psychology and the biology of human-animal interaction. And I actually got into dogs in a kind of roundabout way. I started my career interested mostly in questions about what makes the human mind unique, how our own psychology evolved. So I did a lot of research with primates, working with chimpanzees and bonobos, but I got interested in dogs because it turns out there's some interesting similarities in the social cognition of dogs and humans that may have come about through convergent evolution. And once I started working with dogs, I basically caught the bug pretty quickly, and I realized that there was just a million things that made dogs such a fascinating species to study, and one that I wanted to devote the rest of my career to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for doing it. Dr. McCune, you are up next.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's great to be a part of it. I am currently, my position is I'm visiting professor for the University of Lincoln, which is in the UK, which is where I'm coming from tonight. I also have a consultancy, Animal Matters, which looks at kind of broader animals in society issues, good and bad, and that's been really interesting. And I guess my interest in dogs came about a little bit later than I started. I became interested in pets through work as a teenager volunteering in shelters, and looking at what was going on between owners and pets, and understanding that there was often a sort of disconnect, or there could often be potential for a much richer, better relationship if people understood their animals a bit better, and were kind of clearer to their animals about what their intentions were. And that was really confirmed in my work as a veterinary nurse. And I did a PhD, which was, I have to admit, about cats. So it was focused on cat behavior and welfare. And then when I went to work at the Waltham Pet Care Science Institute, I got then really doing research on dogs, and I've done work on both ever since. So yeah, it was just that idea that actually so many people didn't have the best relationship they could have, and there was such an impact of owner on the animal's behavior, and indeed the impact of the animal's behavior on the owner.
So true. I've seen that for many years myself in the clinic and in other places. So, yep, thanks for doing that. Dr. Horowitz, you're next.
Hey. I am a senior research fellow at Barnard College, where I also teach, and I run a dog cognition lab there. I study, I guess, the perception and cognition of dogs by looking at their natural behavior, sometimes kind of in the wild, interacting with their people and with other dogs, and sometimes in sort of simple experimental settings in our lab. I got interested in dogs a little bit accidentally. I mean, I was always dog besotted as a child, but I didn't think I would study dogs. And in graduate school, a little over 2 decades ago, I decided, because of my interest in non-human animal mind, that I would look for a naturally occurring behavior which might give some insight into the thing I was interested in, which was theory of mind, in potential theory of mind in non-human animals. And I started looking at social play behavior as a really promising entree to that. And dogs eventually occurred to me as the natural subject for that study. And then once I started researching with dogs, I just got interested in the dog qua dog and the dog's experience, and how this ubiquitous animal was sort of understudied in cognitive science. And that has led to my career.
Beautiful. Amazing what you can learn at the dog park, right? Okay, well then, thank you everyone. Thanks for doing that. And so let me start then, we'll go back to the list here, to Dr. Serpell. Question for him. You mentioned, interestingly, you said domestication of dogs and then domestication of wolves. Wanted to tackle a little bit on that, because you recently wrote a paper on really identifying two of the big current theories about domestication. And you wrote more about perhaps the one that's less, I don't know, less in style. That's the one that what people talked about for a long period of time. So I wonder if you could talk about those theories and then why you chose one over the other.
Sure, yes. So it's really getting to the heart of, why people establish this initial relationship with the wild wolf. And there are two kind of competing current theories. Actually, there are more than two, but the two main ones are, first of all, the idea that the wolf got interested in essentially domesticating itself by starting to scavenge off human garbage. And there's this notion that Paleolithic hunters were leaving around sort of unused animal carcasses, and that wolves saw this as an opportunity to get a free lunch, literally. And the role that humans played in all of this was very passive. It was simply one of tolerance. They tolerated having these wolves scrounging around their campsites, and gradually the wolves that scavenged became, sort of bolder. They lost their fear, and the humans, as long as humans continued to tolerate them, you could see a sort of gradual relationship forming between the two, perhaps helped by the fact that these scavenging wolves might bark at intruders or predators or things like that. And so humans would begin to see a benefit to it all. I'd never been thrilled by this theory. And there's an older theory originally formulated by Charles Darwin's second cousin, a chap called Francis Galton back in the 19th century, who simply argued that if he had lots of friends who were explorers going out to unknown parts of the world. And he noted that most of them had seen hunter-gatherer type peoples capturing and keeping wild animals as pets. And these are usually baby animals, which are acquired often as a result of killing the parent. But they bring the baby home. The baby then gets adopted as a pet by the community, by the family. Sometimes these pets, if they were mammals, were even breastfed by human women. And these pets would grow up as essentially part of the social group. And they would be mourned if they died. A lot of effort went into looking after these animals. So pet keeping seemed to be very widespread in these communities. And Galton argued that this must be the origin of domestication, that it must have started with this practice of capturing baby animals, taming them, and then rearing them as members of the human social group. And this seems to me a much more plausible scenario than the idea that humans just tolerated these scavenging wolves around their encampment. There's a lot of other evidence also that supports Galton, I think, and tends to argue against the scavenging idea. But we can maybe go into that later.
Yeah, very interesting. I agree. I think that's always been a little bit of a challenge to have the dumpster dog idea that's been the sole source of the individual that was domesticated. But I think we'd be wise, since we have everyone here, to open it up to the group and see what your all thoughts are on this, because this is obviously a big topic and a keystone to our whole discussion. So let me start with Dr. Horowitz as far as your thoughts.
Well, I was really intrigued to read your paper, James, actually, and as somebody who kind of grew up with the scavenger dog hypothesis. My thinking when I read it was that they're not necessarily completely inconsistent, right? There could be a bit of a grain of truth in both theories, insofar as one can imagine certainly that there were wolves which a little bit self-domesticated, right? Just sort of diverged in their thresholds for tolerance of possible predators like humans. And maybe those were the ones who were likely to then be taken in as pets, as you described. So I was interested in the possibility of not an averaging, but not an exclusionary approach where it's one or the other. I wonder if your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I certainly see there's some, there are many reasons why these sort of early proto dogs would have had the need to scavenge, because they probably weren't always provisioned that well by people. So scavenging certainly went along with the job of being a dog. But I guess the thing, one of the things that stood out for me about the scavenging hypothesis was this argument that domestication just involves loss of fear. And I think that is incomplete by a long chalk. So when wild animals lose their fear of humans, they very often become actually dangerous to humans, because they don't see humans as being social partners. They see humans as just being something they're not afraid of anymore. And indeed, there are some recent examples where this has led to wolves, coyotes, other canids actually attacking and killing people. because people have been tolerating them, people have been feeding them, and the animals lose their fear, and then they become a liability because they don't perceive people as being friends necessarily. In order for an animal to perceive humans as friends, they have to be, obtained at a very early age and properly socialized to humans. And that has to happen when they're very, very young. And if you don't have that process, then you finish up with something that may not be afraid of you, but it may not like you actually, and may see you as a potential meal. And there's plenty of historical record that this has happened in the past.
Very true, sadly. Then let me switch to Dr. McCune as far as just thoughts on why is this discussion important at all, as far as modern day? Why is this discussion about domestication important? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I think it's a really important discussion to have, and I really love the paper. James, is very interesting, and I think it's important because it does inform actually how some of our perceptions about dogs today, and actually understanding, where they come from, the origins of the kind of social group that they were part of, and what they bring from that, even now, today, in terms of the sort of the behavior that's left from that, in terms of having the social, the tools to be a social group member, but also just things like, their amazing ability to problem solve, or, there's various parts of that kind of behavior, the origin behavior, that, if we understand it now and meet that, meet the needs that kind of arise, and it can bring a real richness, I think, to the relationship today. And I think the thing also it made me think about, James, was, you're absolutely right. The idea that you would start to tolerate this extraordinary predator that has absolutely got the ability to kill you, and we know did kill people, with the records in history. Why would you want that? And so for me, I really felt that the position that you proposed made a lot more sense. And I did wonder whether, just like it is for some people even nowadays, the idea of wolf type breeds even can be seen as very kind of iconic. Would there be great kudos if you took the young of the most iconic predator around you possibly at the time and tamed it? Hey, wouldn't you be cool? That sort of thing. And so I thought that was interesting. Maybe they did that, and what it made me wonder about was actually, so what happened to these animals if they did indeed take that route from a mother, maybe, or a mother who was killed, and then once they matured, then actually what happened? What was the next chapter of the story?
Yeah, I can see Dr. McLean nodding his head there. We could spend a couple hours on this. This is good stuff. But just a few minutes, Dr. McLean, what are your thoughts?
Well, I don't come down one way or another here necessarily, but I think there's a lot of, depending on the hypothesis we go with, I think there's some interesting implications for things like, when is it in dog domestication that dogs first become pets, right? So on the scavenger model, dogs get domesticated and they're a part of our lives, but they're not really in a pet role initially. And on the model that James likes, pet keeping is really there from the beginning. And so I think that's an important difference. And just in terms of, why does this matter? I think one of the things that's important to think about here is that however dog domestication happened, this has potential to provide context for the ways that we relate to dogs around the world. And, lots of us, in the United States, for example, think of our relationships with dogs as these animals that sort of sleep on our couch, but that's, not the norm around the world. And so understanding sort of how dogs first came into our lives has potential to inform the highly varied ways that we interact with them around the world.
Yeah. Very good. All right. Well, as I said, we could spend a lot of time on that, but I want to switch gears and go on to another topic here and talk to Dr. Horowitz a little bit about consent, which may be a topic that a lot of people are not familiar with in dogs. So can you give us a feel? I know you wrote the paper recently about consent and human-animal interaction studies. First of all, how do dogs even give consent, and why is that important?
Okay, well, it's a great question, and I might start a little bit back from how one gets consent, just to talk about why I think it's something to think about. Dogs in human-animal interaction studies, since my own research is focusing on the domestic dog, I focused my piece on dog-human interaction studies, are subjects in some way, and they're considered as a group with an average age, an average sex, and so forth. And we don't really enumerate who they are individually. In human studies, they wouldn't be considered subjects, they'd be considered participants, right? Something that we use to acknowledge that the process inherently involves their participation. So my opinion piece was intended to foreground those participants. The dog-human interaction studies that I know of that are out there, most of them are about determining whether the presence of a dog is health-giving to people in various contexts. My colleagues on this panel could say much, much more about that than I. What I wanted to know was the urgent need for the experience of dogs in the studies to be observed. The great majority, which is not to say all, of the research does not look at the experience of dogs. There are a lot of facets to considering the dog. The one you highlight, asking for consent, is kind of at the center of that gem, as it were. As sentient animals, dogs are experiencing their lives. They have things they prefer, they have emotions, there are well-described stress behaviors, which reflects, we must think, that they're experiencing actual stress. So the suggestion was that use of dogs could be predicated on their opting in to participate. Currently, in some teams, dogs have an opt-out. So a keenly observing handler could see if their dog is too stressed, for instance, to continue to participate happily in a session. And I'm all for identifying poor welfare and working to remedy that. But I'm thinking a step earlier, right? Insisting on the presence of positive welfare for these participants. So as part of that, the suggestion was that dogs should be asked whether they want to do it at all, just as a human participant in research can give consent. And the human participants in this research give consent. Trainers can easily teach opt-in behaviors, which are just behaviors that dogs have learned allows them to mark when they want to, for instance, start a session. And they can withhold that opt-in as a way of saying that they aren't ready to start, don't want to start. The importance of this, to get to the second part of your question, is, I think, twofold. One, it's expanding our sphere of concern to be not just around the human, but also around the dog. In dog-human interaction studies, dogs are, the agent that enables the research to be done to begin with. And two, it's moving from instrumentalizing animals to seeing them as individuals with experiences, which should be accounted for.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thought, because it seems like such a thing we should have thought about all along. And again, even as a veterinarian, I just never really thought of that before. One of the lines I wrote down from your paper was dogs are treated less as subjects than as stimuli, and that really kind of hit me. I thought that was important, and it's an interesting thought. Sadly, that's an interesting thought to me, that dogs need to be looked at as individuals. So thank you for that. Dr. McCune, as one of the topic editors on this whole effort here, you had to deal with papers on improving accuracy of human-animal interaction findings and studies and all that. We all know that there are all sorts of challenges associated with that. It's the papers and scientific studies are always a bit of a challenge. So what areas stuck out to you that you felt like were prime areas of improvement?
Yeah, they are indeed a very varied set of papers in the Frontier series that is linked to the workshop that happened, and I would recommend people go and look at those. You can download them for free and have a look. But there was actually one paper in particular that focused in on this very topic, which is why do we see such variability in results in human-animal interaction studies, which is where I've spent most of my research time looking at that. And Alexandra has raised some really important issues, you know, about the dog perspective in human-animal interaction, because so often, nearly always, in fact, we are focused on the human in human-animal interaction. And it was a really refreshing paper, I thought, to really bring the dog perspective on that. And at its most fundamental, human-animal interaction studies are, you know, they're about two very complex organisms and getting together and interacting with each other and affecting the behavior of each other. And so it's really important that we look at both of those. And it's not a surprise that we see enormous variability in both the human, but also the animal. And increasingly now that's being looked at, and also considerations about the welfare of the animal and so on is an important part, I think, of looking at trying to standardize really the way in which we go about doing these kind of studies. I think one of the things we're starting to see now, but has been pretty rare really in the past, is in studies that we're actually manualizing the protocols for intervention studies. So where we have animal-assisted intervention studies, and the dog effectively has been brought in as a treatment, and so often there is, you know, no mention of what kind of dog, how old, what's the gender of that dog, you know, very little information. And so we need detailed descriptions of the animal. We need manualization of the protocol so that they're standardized, and really detailed descriptions of the interaction itself. What does it look like? Could you repeat it? You know, these are basic questions in terms of science process. So all of these things, I think, should really help us as we go forward in studies for the future. And there are some other sort of basic things that, you know, there's been calls for a long time now in terms of just using standardized measures, you know, measuring the same thing in the same way across studies so we can compare it, that sort of thing, using standardized terminology. Human-animal interaction is an incredibly diverse sort of interdisciplinary topic. And so there are lots of different methods sort of, you know, come together sometimes that measure the same or very similar things in different ways. And we need to get more of a standardized terminology. And again, these things we're beginning to see, so there's, you know, definitely signs of doing that. But I think, and certainly the authors in many of the papers across this series would make that case that actually there's a bit further to go yet in that to get really good solid studies in this area.
Agreed. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how it's such a diverse population among dogs, followed only, I guess, by us. I saw a picture recently of Shaquille O'Neal standing next to Simone Biles, and it was, you know, ridiculous. And we don't talk about how homogenous the human, but we talk about the dog. So I think we're working away from that, obviously, but it's an interesting. It's so in your face. Dr. Mclean, let's talk about working dog training. Some of the papers that were in this group as well talked about suggestions for improving working dog training. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. You know, the way that I think about it, training is a piece of what we need to improve, but I guess I like to think about improving working dog programs more generally. And I think to answer the question, it helps to sort of step back for a second and say, well, why do we need to improve anything? We see all these great working dogs that seem to be doing their jobs. But in reality, these are really demanding jobs that these dogs work in. And in many major organizations around the world, only about half of the dogs that begin training for these roles ultimately make it. And that has real impacts on people and on the dogs themselves. So if you think about, for example, a service dog helping somebody with a disability, if we have a shortage of these dogs, that leads to things like long waiting lists, you know, where people are waiting to get a dog that they can really benefit from, and it would be great to have more of these dogs available. And you know, on the dog side of these things, the dogs that don't make it through these programs have what we call a change of career. So they're, you know, on this one track, and then they don't do this anymore, and they become a pet dog, and that's a potentially stressful thing for the dog. So, you know, being able to sort of optimize this and really only work with dogs that have a high probability of success is important. And I think the one way to look at it is that there's three main sets of things that we can do to try and improve these programs. One happens at the genetic level, and you know, we have learned over decades now that genetic factors play a really strong role in a dog's potential for success as a working dog. And so if we can set up systematic breeding programs that can breed dogs with characteristics that help them succeed here, that can go a long way. And there are many organizations around the world that have done this quite successfully. It takes a long time. It's complicated to have a breeding program. It's complicated to make good decisions about breeding, but we can do this and we can improve working dogs in that way. The second thing we can do is to develop better screening procedures for selecting dogs to even begin these training programs. So when I say selecting now, I'm not talking about genetic selection and breeding dogs, but talking about developing standardized assessments of different aspects of temperament and behavior, where we can try and identify dogs that have the most potential to succeed even before they start training. So these first two things, the breeding decisions and selecting dogs for these programs, those are things that happen even before the training process begins. They're things about what dogs begin the training process. The last bit, it has to do with training itself and whether we can modify training practices to be more effective. And I think there's a lot that we don't know there right now. A lot of training practices are based in learning theory that has developed across the last century, but probably in the last 2 decades, we have learned more about the dog's mind than we have in the preceding century. And we know dogs are capable of all kinds of interesting things now, things like social learning that we're not really taking advantage of in the way that we train dogs now. And so there may be exciting ways that we can change training to take advantage of dogs' abilities to learn socially from other working dogs or from the trainers they're working with. And I think that's going to be one of the fun things to see unfold in the decades ahead.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Probably just within the way things are going in the next 20, 30 years, we may see really impressive changes. Thank you for that. So we go back to Dr. Serpell about dogs and our timeline with dogs. How do you think, talk a little bit about how dogs have their early relationships with humans have changed dramatically up to where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long and complicated history. So it's now believed the dog might have been domesticated or the wolf might have been domesticated as long as 40,000 years ago, which is a very long time. And for most of that early career, these domestic pets were perhaps helping their owners to guard against predators or marauding other neighboring tribes, perhaps helping with hunting. We don't really know. There's certainly some early evidence that people were using dogs for hunting or these proto-dogs for hunting, but it's not clear how widespread that was. And then sort of over time, I think sort of dogs have acquired increasingly specialized roles. So even within just the domain of something like hunting, you now see breed specializations for dogs that herd but don't kill animals, dogs that go underground and chase vermin, dogs that have incredible speed and good vision and can chase down a running animal, and other dogs that just have incredible noses and can follow game. So even just within one domain like hunting, we see this incredible amount of specialization going on. And we see that pretty much across the board, whichever role that we've used these incredible animals for, we've seen them become increasingly specialized within those roles to serve more and more refined purposes over time. So it's really quite incredible, the the evolution and diversification of the dog that has taken place in what is a very, very short time in evolutionary terms. I mean, 40,000 years may seem like a long time, but from an evolutionary perspective, it's a blink of the eye. So it's really phenomenal what has happened to this. What has happened to the wolf essentially in this time?
Indeed. Yep. See those little ones in their strollers going around this down the park. That's a big change. So here's an interesting one really for everybody, and I'll call you out so we don't have the Zoom talkover situation. Interested to know from each one of you guys, what do you think is the biggest benefit of, I don't even know if we say pet ownership, but having a dog in your life, coexisting with a dog? What is the biggest benefit, and what do you think is the benefit that's oftentimes the most over exaggerated or overdone a little bit? Let me start with Dr. McCune. Who's on mute?
Hi. Yeah, I think for me, probably, you know, the dog's kind of superpower really is its ability to attach and to connect really with another species. You know, you take a step back and think about that for a minute, you know, how strange that is that you can get the kind of level and depth of relationship between two completely different species, and that the dog seems to be a willing partner in that. You know, why would that be? Why does it make? And I think, you know, we just have we have a very fundamental human need to connect with others, and dogs allow us to do that with the dog themselves. But I think importantly, what they also do is they enable us to connect to other people. And for me, that's certainly, you said overreported, but actually it probably is underreported, or the surprise, I think, really is the impact that they can have in terms of wider societal connections. You know, having looked at this with collaborators at the university in Perth, of University of Western Australia, you know, it's extraordinary really the level of impact that it can have just by you going out with your dog and other people seeing you. And, you know, we know from studies now that they're much more likely to talk to you and talk to you for longer and about more things. And the studies with the University of Western Australia showed as well that, you know, you're much more likely to form friendships if you were a dog owner than a non-dog owner when you went into a new area. It was a really strong effect, and that those initial contacts actually developed into friendships, and, you know, with measurable kind of forms of tangible support. And so there's this kind of ripple effect that this amazing ability to connect with others that the dog has goes not just to the person who shares their life in that home, but actually right across the neighborhood, changes perspective, you know, perceptions of the neighborhood to be more friendly, to be safer. It has this extraordinary wider impact on all of society, not just for pet owners.
Let me just follow up then. Is there a concern or a danger or anything? And again, this is a total open question. Are we over promising for what dogs can do? Or is that a safe statement that we can just say that really chances are good that if you get a dog, those things will happen?
Sorry, was that for me?
Yeah, I just following up from that question.
Okay,
Sorry.
Yeah, I just didn't hear it. Yes, of course there is. You know, in what we tend to hear about, of course, are the headlines, which is, you know, dogs have these almost magical powers of bringing health benefits and you know, great joy and well-being to people. And of course they can. You know, we see that and studies show that, but of course that is not universal. And there are many people out there who have very conflicted or difficult relationships with their companion animals. I think, again, it goes back to this thing that I started with about, you know, there are so many relationships that actually aren't as good as they could be. And if there was a bit more education, a bit more learning and understanding and so on, that I think that relationship could be an awful lot better. And just, you know, investment in the right way in training the animal behavior, understanding the behavior of the animal, and meeting the needs of the animal, then I think relationships could be a lot more positive and are likely to have better health benefits in that case. So yeah, we see negatives and positives.
Dr. Mclean, what are your thoughts on best benefit to having a dog and maybe one that's outside the tracks a little bit there?
Well, I think maybe I can start with you know, the misconception that a lot of people have, which is I think that, you know, a lot of people think they want to that if they get a dog, they'll be less depressed or they'll be less lonely. And for many people that might be true, but you know, that's one of the places where we just don't have good evidence to suggest that's the case. You know, there's, as far as I know, there's no good data that suggests that if you're lonely and depressed and you get a dog, that you will be less lonely and depressed. You may be, but we just, you know, we don't want to oversell what the science tells us right now, and the science does not, I don't think, support that conclusion at the moment. In terms of the actual, you know, what are the most important benefits, though? I think in reality, there may be a lot of benefits to our relationships with dogs that are very hard to quantify and that may sort of elude our current research for that reason. You know, there are these transient moments of just fun and you know, emotional enjoyment, connecting with, sitting on the couch, connecting with your pet, you know, throwing a tennis ball in the yard, something like that. And those kinds of things may not translate into long-term changes in depressive symptoms or something like that, but there are real moments in a person's life that bring joy. And I think we also don't want to downplay the potential importance of those kinds of things.
Absolutely. Dr. Horowitz, what do you think?
For me, I think one of the benefits of living with dogs is the kind of humbling reminder that humans aren't the center of the world, right? As we continually push nature out and are more alienated from non-human animals, it's interesting to have a non-human animal in our homes. They oblige the extension of ourselves to care for another species, and they remind us that there are other ways of being, which itself could reflect back on our interaction with other humans. But I'm also just interested in it on its own sake for our thinking about non-humans. And I would second or third, I guess, what Sandra and Evan says that about what's misrepresented as always a benefit, that the presence of dogs is always salutary. It's certainly not always health-giving. It's not inevitably going to improve one's life to live with an animal. And I would say as a new thing to consider that by bringing dogs into the sphere of human homes, we're also bringing, putting extra types of pressures on the environment. The amount of agriculture that's necessary to sustain these animals is not trivial. And so it viewed from a purely utilitarian perspective, the cost benefit analysis might not necessarily lean on the plus side for dogs. There are a lot of deficits to the kind of commercialization and the industries that have evolved around dog ownership.
Great point. Dr. Serpell.
Yes, all of the above. I mean, I agree with all the previous speakers. I mean, I think we just have to understand that, relationships vary in their quality, and that applies to marriages, and it applies to human-dog relationships. It applies to all of our relationships. And, sometimes, as Sandra mentioned, these relationships go incredibly well and are very mutually rewarding for both the person and the dog. But that's not always the case. And it goes back to what Alexandra was saying about consent, or maybe assent is a better word, in the sense that if we're going to benefit from these relationships with these animals, that relationship has to be voluntary on their part. They have to want to be involved in that relationship. We can't force another individual to like us, to want to be with us, to want to connect with us and communicate with us. That has to come from the other individual. Otherwise, the relationships has no value. So really, it's very important that this is a mutual relationship, that both parties benefit from it.
Absolutely. Good thoughts. Okay, well, let me shift gears again here a little bit to welfare, as far as what we can do to ensure that we're proactively improving the welfare of dogs in our lives. And this one I'll split between you guys, since we have four of you here. I'll send the first question to Dr. Serpell and McCune, and I'll break you up here. Your thoughts on perspective as far as improving welfare for the personal dog point of view, for the pet dog point of view. Let me then we'll do Dr. Horowitz and Dr. McLean to talk about working dogs. So let me start with Dr. McCune on welfare on the personal dog.
Yeah. So I think there's been a great increase and focus on dog welfare in recent years, having not been really looked on, for a long time. We looked at farm animals, laboratory animals, welfare, and so on, but we've been slow really getting to companion animals. So it's great to see that. I think from a practical point of view with owners, to use that term, one of the things that I'd love to see is that owners would get a greater understanding actually of being able to read read the animals they share their lives with. So many owners are very, very poor still at reading body language in dogs and cats and other species that they share their lives with. And so it's very difficult for them, I think, if they are going through that process of considering, so what are the needs of this animal in this relationship and how can I meet them? You know, to then be trying different things and potentially asking for consent, but also understanding body language and what that's saying is a very important part of that. And I think this is just, you know, it's basic education really, and it's the sort of thing that it would be fabulous if all prospective dog owners, before they got their dogs, you know, could do some work in and understand and be able to better read what their animal is trying to say to them.
Agreed. Everyone should take a little 6-week course or something before you get the dog. Dr. Serpell, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly helping owners to understand and communicate with their animals would be a great first step. I think part of the problem also is that companion animals have been sort of branded now as being beneficial and everybody wants one. But many people who acquire them aren't really well set up in their environment to keep an animal. So, you know, I see people in my urban neighborhood which, you know, reluctantly walking their dog sort of halfway around the block twice a day. And that's the animal's daily exercise. And we're talking about an animal here that, you know, sometimes in the wild, you know, dogs will travel 30 or 40 miles a day. They have enormous amounts of energy and they're very inquisitive and exploratory because they need that to survive on their own. And we don't really, we treat them the way, I mean, I think we kind of project onto them our own kind of instincts for being a couch potato. And that is bad for the animal. And we know that many of the sort of behavior problems that dogs develop are a direct consequence of that, of not being, simply not having enough to do in life. And they develop all sorts of strange behaviors as a consequence. People get the wrong kinds of breeds of dogs. You know, these breeds go through fads. For a long time, everybody wanted a border collie because border collies were super intelligent. But border collies, you know, in their sort of natural state, work. That's what they do. They work very hard. They're highly motivated to work. If you don't give them a job to do, they find jobs to do, and it's not the kind of jobs you want them doing. They'll be very persistent, doing all kinds of crazy things and driving you slowly sort of round the bend. And it's you know, there's really, I guess, a failure on the part of people to realize just how complex these animals are, how complex their needs are. And I guess it's a failure of education, really, that people are just, they're going into this relationship without a proper understanding of what it entails. And that's a source of serious welfare problems across the board.
Agreed. I personally, from my background, I think of medical complications. You see an awful lot, just as with humans, cardiovascular disease and obesity and all these things that are secondary to them doing things they should not be doing, just like with us. Okay, so let me switch then. Same question regarding working dogs to Dr. Horowitz.
I thought both of those were beautiful answers, by the way, and also apply to working dogs to some extent. There's so many types of working dogs, actually, that there's not one type of relationship that I could call out as specifically representing all of them. But in many cases, I see a couple of things that could be improved. For instance, in lots of working dog training regimes, there were a lot of failures. And I know that in some of those working dog relationships, there are attempts to try to minimize those failures, and I think there's not enough has been done. So you have a lot of dogs who fail to achieve what the level they're supposed to be a seeing eye dog, to be trained as a detection dog, and more effort and research on our part in assuring that dogs who were properly trained are able to continue would be useful. And then also in that handoff point. I was surprised to see the first time I really looked at working dog relationships that often dogs are trained early in life and then handed to people who don't have experience with dogs, period, as handlers. And so again, talking about dogs being instrumentalized, they're just the tool that a police officer, say, is given to do their job. And there really, really needs to be a lot more education for A, that to be a satisfactory relationship for both partners, and B, for the dog to get their due, essentially. So that's, I think, important. It's not the case with all working dog teams that the person is unknowledgeable about dogs, but it's allowed, and it is not uncommon. And then third, to ensure that there is off time to do the types of bonding with people that, that this social species needs to do. Working dogs can be highly satisfied in their jobs, the behavior seems to indicate. And sometimes they're doing things which make them look much more satisfied than a pet dog's life, absolutely. But they then might be neglected for their downtime, or they may not be given downtime. And so ensuring that there's some possibility of socialization with people with other dogs, depending on the dog, would be part of good welfare.
Absolutely. Dr. Mclean, your thoughts?
Sure. So I think, we get hung up on thinking about the success of working dogs for reasons I mentioned earlier, which is that a lot of dogs who try to go into these roles, or who people try to put into these roles, is probably a better way to say it, are not successful. But I think if you think about the reasons why that might be, there's probably at least two axes of variation that are interesting to consider. And one is a dog's sort of competence for the job. Can they get the duties of the job done? And we have some dogs who are very good and they can do everything the job requires, and other dogs who are very bad and they can't carry out those roles. But then you have this other sort of axis about, does the dog actually enjoy the work, right? And you can have sort of these weird situations where you can have a dog who's totally competent for the job. They can do all of the things that are required, but they may not like doing it. And I think that that's where welfare can be compromised. So I think when you're selecting dogs, you're looking for this sort of sweet spot where you have a dog who is capable of doing all the things that you need them to do, but is also motivated to do that and enjoys doing that. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that's gonna have a huge impact on welfare. And James mentioned just a moment ago, border collies who don't have a job will find a job, and you want a dog who gravitates towards whatever job they have as a working dog and wants to do that work. That's going to do a lot to improve welfare, I think.
Great. Well, man, that went fast. I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question, though, to you guys, and then we'll take at least one question maybe from everybody. I'll push it and go over a little bit if you guys are willing. I just wanted to talk, just a few minutes, but with Dr. McLean and Dr. McCune, since you guys were co-editors of the Frontiers and Veterinary Medicine group or papers, just your thoughts on this whole thing and working with everybody, and why is this overall important to you guys? So let's start with Dr. McLean. Sorry.
So do you want to start, Evan?
Sure. Well, I think one of the nicest things for me, at least, was that this is a group of people. Many of us have known each other for a long time. We cross paths at conferences, but we often have not had the opportunity to just sort of sit down and think about a topic, from nothing together, and to collaborate kind of out of the blue. A lot of collaborations arise because people are working on related things, and it's something just sort of happens that makes collaboration practical. But really, I think in a lot of these papers, this created opportunities for people who might not necessarily, everyone knows each other's work and has been influenced by it in some way, but these are groups of authors who may not have ever written papers together, who now had a wonderful opportunity to spend a lot of time talking with other people in the field and sort of fusing their perspectives to write some of these papers. And I think that has been maybe, in my opinion, maybe one of the best parts of this series.
Very cool. Thank you. Dr. McCune, what do you think?
I would totally agree with that. I think it was a fabulous opportunity, and thanks to Wallis Annenberg PetSpace for hosting the workshop, because as I think I said in the film, it was just this incredible opportunity to dedicate 2 whole days of thinking and collaborating. And that's rare. It's actually quite rare to get that kind of quality time and length of dedicated time to really think deeply about subjects that, are maybe adjacent to what you normally spend your day thinking about. But, the number of ideas that were sparking and were collected and then finally represented in the series of papers that there are in this Frontier series, I think were great because they're really good quality work, but also the depth and the range of the papers. It starts right from the very origins of domesticating the wolf, as James has talked about, but right through to incredible work with these sort of extraordinarily athletic dogs that are doing this work that we ask them to do in an incredibly competent way much of the time, and then also the sort of thing I focused on was again just what we know about sharing our lives with animals and the way that can impact, in this case, healthy active aging, but other health benefits as well. And I think it's important because there's so much science coming out, and I think a lot of this is really pertinent to how people who share their lives with animals and are working with dogs in this case can get their head around just the pace of the science really that's coming out now in canine science and can apply it to what they're doing. And so this kind of a series I think will be a really valuable resource to the field. And again, thanks to the generosity of Wallis Annenberg PetSpace, these are free to download, so anybody can download the original papers if they want to have a look at the detail.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's absolutely fantastic. That must have been an amazing 48 hours for all of you guys. All right, so I'll just do one since again, we're a little tight and we're actually a minute over, but I wanted to throw this one out because it is kind of an interesting question. I guess I'll send it to Dr. Horowitz first since we had talked about consent the most with her, but I'd invite you guys to throw in thoughts at all. Just the question is, would using a working dog involve ongoing consent, and how do you assess that with a working dog?
Yeah, well, my proposal was just in the context of research that involved dogs, but I can certainly imagine that for the exact same reasons, one would want to have consent for a working dog. Not only would I think the relationship work better, but insofar as we're interested in positive welfare for working dogs, it would be a step in that direction, enabling them to be a part of deciding when they're able to do this. And I think, in fact, in some working dog relationships, this would already be the case. It would already be instituted, that a search begins, for instance, once the dog has assented that they are ready to search and often quite eager to search.
Yeah. And then doing that, ongoing. Other thoughts there before we wrap up?
Well, we've talked about consent with research animals and working animals, but I also would just make the plea for people who share their homes with pet dogs, as it were, companion animal dogs, would also use that. I think it's been really, really powerful for owners when they realize how simple it is actually to ask for consent in the dogs that they live with, and then to suddenly shift the relationship a little bit by asking permission to interact.
Absolutely. Let's see. I'm looking. I think we're trying to find any additional questions. Let's see. Yep, we're just asking. I have a question. How about this one? Since we're waiting for other questions, I'm curious. Watching again from a veterinary point of view. I apologize for that, but in a bigger point of view, the little Boston Dynamics robots, the little dog robots. I know you guys have talked, and other people have talked about artificial intelligence. Thoughts about that impacting the dog-human relationship, and that there at some point in time there may be an automated little thing that we can perceive almost identically to a dog, feel the same way, but never be sick, never need vaccines, never die, never go to the veterinarian. Is that a realistic thing in the future, do you think, or is that just silliness? I'll throw that to Dr. Serpell.
Wow, that's an interesting question. I mean, there hasn't been much research on how people perceive these animated robots relative to how they perceive, a real dog. There has been some research, And the research that I'm thinking of was conducted at Purdue University quite a long time ago, where they compared people's responses to one of the IBO robotic dogs and their responses to a real dog. And actually some of the findings were a little chilling, that people who'd had experience of interacting with the IBO, who then went on to interact with a real dog, behaved quite differently towards the real dog. In other words, they were much less empathic with the real dog and tended to objectify it more as a result of their interaction with the robot. And I found that result rather disturbing. That, you know, interactions if interactions with robots make people less empathic and more inclined to objectify real dogs, what's it doing to our interactions with each other,
right?
Among other things. And I think this is an area that's ripe for further research. I really do.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I do too. I wonder how that will play out. Here's another one. This has just popped up. How do you think human treatment of dogs has, let's see, how do you think human treatment of dogs has changed in terms of infantilization? Do you think this is detrimental to the dog-human relationship as a whole, or is this an instinctive treatment, a small, fluffy, possibly vulnerable non-human animal, particularly with puppies? Any takers on that one?
Yeah, I can speak to that a bit.
Okay.
I mean, I think what we've seen is a huge shift, haven't we, between, as James talked about earlier, actually, you know, breeds that come in and out of fashion. And certainly there is a fashion currently for dogs which have the features, you know, the neonatic sort of features of babies. So classically, that would be the pugs, the little French bulldogs, and so on. You know, big eyes, high foreheads, that we are hardwired to respond to for kind of obvious evolutionary reasons, because they look a bit like babies. And that's very much part of our dog culture at the moment. And I suppose the problem with that is, you know, that people aren't, again, I think James was saying, you know, there isn't necessarily, people don't necessarily get the right breed for them. And some of these breeds inevitably will suit people, but some of them may not. You know, and if you're, I don't know, if you're someone who actually wants to take your dogs on long hikes, then, you know, perhaps a pug is not your first choice. But certainly there's a lot of marketing around that infantilization, and that has been, certainly has been a part of the journey, I think, right from, you know, functional dogs that had a job, a dog that, you know, people will say, you'll hear this expression, a dog that looks like a dog, which generally means a fairly sort of medium to large breed that doesn't have any extreme features, to nowadays where actually we've selected for very extreme features to meet this need within us, where we respond to dogs that have these kind of features, you know, and that can result then obviously in flat-faced breeds, the brachycephalic breeds, which then may bring health issues to those dogs themselves. So it becomes a welfare issue. So yeah, you know, it's part of the culture at the moment.
It can be provided too, as well. I remember after 101 Dalmatians came out from Disney, that was just a disaster for all of us in veterinary medicine for many years. Many Dalmatians are sweethearts, but they were not in the best choice for families in many cases. All right, how about your thoughts on addressing challenges with aging of pet dogs and aging older retired working dogs? Maybe I'll throw that to Dr. McLean.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think start to just sort of acknowledge the situation. Obviously, aging dogs face lots of risks to their health and potential compromises to their welfare in the same way that happens with people. But I think it's actually right now is probably the most promising time for us to think about those questions, because dogs have actually become a very attractive species for aging researchers to study, and a lot of that research is done with the hope that you know, dogs will be a model for certain questions about human health. But it's also done in a One Health kind of spirit, in that if we can learn things about the aging process and how to ensure that we have healthy aging in dogs. The hope is to translate some of that work to humans, but at the same time, that should feed right back into veterinary medicine. So I think there's actually going to be a lot of great research in the next couple decades where we address important questions about aging that can have positive impacts on quality of life in both aging people and aging dogs. Awesome. That's good to hear. Then there's a question about, is there a book that you recommend, or a video or training or a author or a person, a resource that can help us understand cognition of companion animals a little better? Maybe I'll throw that to Dr. Horowitz.
Well, it's funny you say that, since I've written several books on dog cognition, but that's an easy answer. I can recommend the books of some of my colleagues as well on cognition, like Brian Hare and Greg Burns and John Bradshaw. And James wrote a book that's not on cognition per se, but was one of my favorite books on, well, he's written a book on the domestic dog, but even before that, called In the Company of Animals, about the animal-human interaction, which I think is, well, I don't know if you've revised that, James, but it's still quite forward-thinking. And I would recommend that to anyone.
Very good. Yeah, there's no shortage of information on that. It's a fascinating topic. And as we've said, it's growing like crazy. Thoughts on cross-cultural research on human-animal? That's a biggie, but anything specific on cross-cultural research in human-animal interaction? Let's see. How about Dr. McCune?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, the obvious thing to say is there is so little research on this. So there are a few people now doing research in this area. So Brenda Jagathisen in particular in the US, and also Dennis Turner in Europe have done a lot of work in this area, but relatively there's been very little work, and it's been relatively very recently, and that's great to see. Because there is an issue here. You know, the call is that you know, there's research across cultures, but even cultures, you know, different cultures within the US is so important. And actually, still an awful lot of the studies are predominantly, you know, white middle class owners of dogs and cats that are in studies. And so there is a real need to have more diverse populations where possible. It's not always possible, but where possible. And certainly for over a decade, I was involved with a public-private partnership between Mars and the National Institutes of Health. And that was always one of the things that went into the calls that they issued for the studies that were funded through that partnership, was to have more diverse populations. And that's what it needs. It needs to be written in absolutely at the very beginning as a criteria for our studies, so that they're more representative, because they haven't been in the past. And so that we understand, you know, what is the pet ownership experience like, you know, for a Hispanic 30-year-old guy, and how is that different, you know, living in a certain part of your country compared to, you know, a white middle-class person in the north of the country. You know, they can be very different on a whole range of socio-demographic factors, as well as ethnic factors. So yeah, we've got to do better, I think, on this.
Agreed. Yep. Well, there you go, students out there to say there's nothing left to study. there's a lot of rich opportunities there. Well, I would love to just say, let's all fill our coffees again and go again for another hour, but we can't do that. So I am going to wrap things up. I so appreciate the time for all of you. Just wonderful spending time with you guys, and fun to have a discussion like this, kind of globally, really. And I guess it's the only silver lining of COVID that we get to do this pretty easily. So I will turn it back to Donna. And again, thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flynn, doing a fantastic job as moderator. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the 4 panelists, not only for participating today, but I know we asked a lot of you, having you come to PetSpace and the retreats. James and Alexandra were at the first one, which I was not present at, but then Evan and Sandra were at the second. And it was been such a joy working with all of you and your willingness to come together for this series, which will be released as an ebook. So when you're talking about which books to read, keep your eye open for the ebook, which will be the compendium of all 13 papers from the series. And so, and we hope eventually to convene another group, and it may be on cats, but we'll see when that happens. We hope we can get to the other major group of pets that we support at PetSpace. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to know that our next Animal Matters session will be on Thursday, September 16th, and we'll be inviting a curator from the Los Angeles Zoo to discuss their California condor conservation project. Because this ties in, actually, our benefactor, Wallis Annenberg, was very generous to support a major wildlife crossing over a highway in Los Angeles. And so we wanted to partner with the LA Zoo to talk about another local conservation project. So if you want to find more about our events and upcoming speakers, please go on our website, annenbergpetspace.org, so that you can continue to follow us and participate. And thank you to all of you out there for tuning in and for those great questions as well.